So I welcome you all again for this very important event. Some few housekeeping rules before I hand over the microphone to Nihal. Uh, uh, we will have the panelists, five distinguished panelists, if I'm not wrong, 6 distinguished panelists. So what we'll have, each panelist will talk for around 12 to 15 minutes max. I will actually give them a bit of timing note that at around 10 minutes that you have 2 to 3 minutes left, and then we'll have an open discussion session. So I'd request all the participants to mute their microphone while the speaker is speaking. And also, if you really want to make any comment during the open discussion session, and also if you want to speak, please let me know in the chat box, or you can raise your hand. So I will moderate that accordingly. So with this, over to you, Nihal, and thank you once again.
Thank you, Salim. Good morning to everybody in South Asia and in Thailand, and good evening to those late in the evening in the US. Welcome, everyone. My name is Nihal Pitikal. I co-technical lead this program with Salim and Sanim. I represent WBD in Washington, DC. So we are launching this USAID and the US Department of State funded interactive training and capacity building program in the Bengal region, Bay of Bengal region, to promote within South Asia and between South Asia and East Asia. The region holds, as you know, great promise, but faces significant hurdles realizing this potential in terms of the barriers in terms of logistics, trade rules, institutional and human capital gaps that currently limit the trade to a fraction of its potential. We know that story. Over the next 12 months, the program is to develop a stakeholder capacity to encourage critical thinking on how to understand these obstacles and explore benefits through existing institutions and new frameworks. So we are not limiting to one particular framework in this region. This program also aim to enhance the analytical and negotiating skills, basically of the policymakers to engage in trade policy formulation and implementation, and also monitoring and surveillance. We have assembled a group of leading economists and other experts from renowned think tanks and other organizations from Bangladesh, India, Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Thailand that will conduct this capacity building session. Let me take this opportunity to thank Salim and Sanim team for orchestrating this training program and managing logistics in multiple countries. They have done a fascinating job so far in such a short period of time. Yesterday, as Professor Rahman mentioned, we had a fascinating discussion. The program was kicked off by a keynote address from Professor Panagaria. I just wanted to highlight some of the points he touched upon. He touched upon many of the reasons that countries opt to more openness and how the income distribution question can be addressed, and about the role of industrial policy, etc. But I think that there are a few sort of hints he gave out. I will be very brief about this. He principally suggests the multilateral framework to continue to be weak unless US takes a large interest and initiative. In the absence of a robust multilateral system, a regional trade becomes important. This region has not had a significant agreement with East Asia or other regions and large countries. As a result, the trade has been underwhelming, even before the pandemic. So he highlighted a great example of Vietnam based on the arguments and nuances he sort of presented, that Vietnam had multiple agreements and agreements with countries with consequence. As a result, for example, its electronic exports, which was at 10 billion in 2010, and now it has reached 122 billion last year. We also touched upon a few things that will be of interest that I think the expert panelists will touch upon: the complexity of the value chain, the need for the value chains to become entire chain to become free of tariff, because otherwise the protection levels are compounded rather than having just one tariff in single countries, but every country has them, little bit tariff on tariff. So he's touched upon the industrial policy, and basically his argument was that allowing exchange rate adjustments can achieve the same objectives without distortion to the economy. So without using protectionist instruments. Today, we have a panel of experts that will discuss the emerging challenges from COVID to supply chain issues, to regional trade and regional energy cooperation. With that brief, I will hand over to Salim. Over to you, Salim. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nihal. I think you set the kind of tone for today's discussion, and especially you have actually connected what discussion was yesterday. And now today's we have actually a set of very important topics to be presented by our distinguished set of panelists. We have 6 panelists today, so I'll very briefly actually introduce them to you because they have vast experience, they have worked quite a lot for years on their fields. But in very short time, it's not possible to introduce them properly. But so our first panelist, Dr. Sanjay Katuria. He's now the Senior Visiting Fellow at the Center for Policy Research, India. But actually, Sanjay worked for 27 years at the World Bank. Sanjay, correct me if I'm wrong, whether that 27 years was right or wrong. But he worked in South Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean and Eastern Europe, including field assignments in New Delhi and Dhaka. He was based in Dhaka for some years too. So he will talk on regional cooperation integration in COVID-19 era and going forward. So that will be an exciting presentation. We are sincerely looking forward to it. Then our next panelist is Ambassador Sumit Nakandala, who is at this moment, Director, Pathfinder Foundation, Sri Lanka. And he's a former career diplomat and a member of the Sri Lanka Foreign Service. And he was the first Secretary General of the BIMSTEC Secretariat, which is based in Dhaka. And Ambassador Sumit Nakandala, will be talking on re-emerging global order and future of BIMSTEC. Our third panelist is Dr. Indrajit Kumarasamy, who is the Distinguished Fellow of Pathfinder Foundation in Colombo, Sri Lanka. And he was the 14th Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. And he has a long career in working in different positions, especially he was at the Commonwealth Secretariat too. And I have a long-standing relationship with him. So, and he will be talking on macroeconomic stress of COVID-19 and recovery. Our next panelist is Dr. Mustafizur Rahman, and he's the Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Policy Dialogue, Dhaka, Bangladesh. And he was the Executive Director of CPD and also the Professor at the Dhaka University. And he will be talking on impact of COVID-19 on global and regional value chains and issues for the Bay of Bengal countries. Our fifth panelist is Dr. Swanee Magle. At this moment, he's the Chief Economic Advisor, UNDP Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific. But he is a former Vice Chair and member of the National Planning Commission of Nepal. So Swanee is a very good friend of us and a very prominent face from Nepal and also from this region. And he'll be talking on energy cooperation and clean energy. And our final panelist would be Dr. Sutipant Chirativat. And he's an Executive Director, ASEAN Studies Center, and the Chairman of Chula Global Network, and an Emeritus Professor of Economics at Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. So glad to see you, Professor Chirativat. And he'll be talking on ASEAN experiences dealing with COVID-19 and ASEAN BIMSTEC cooperation. So audience, you can understand that actually we tried to link the discussion to the very current situation, the COVID-19, the global order, the trade impact, the value chain, energy cooperation, and many other related issues, and especially, of course, the regional cooperation too. So as I said, I will kind of give them a kind of little bit of warning that at around 10 minutes that you have 2 to 3 minutes left. So we'll start with Dr. Sanjay Katuria. If any panelist wants to share any PowerPoint, please do let us know. You have already made co-host, so I think it should not be a problem. Over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you very much, Salim. And I'm just trying to share my screen and see, do you see that screen?
Yes.
Yeah,
fine.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm absolutely delighted to be here and making use of my presence in India in the same time zone as most of you. And I remember when I was in amongst, as I lived in Dhaka, but also amongst my many visits to Dhaka, Sumit hosted me in BIMSTEC, and we had a nice discussion with colleagues there. So given sort of what I've been tasked to speak on, I will focus on broad brush issues, right? There is no time to get into real nitty-gritties, but I will focus on trade mostly. But there are, of course, other economic opportunities that do exist, as Salim said. And my main point is that it will make a lot of sense to for each country to be utilizing the opportunities afforded by this region, the Bay of Bengal region. So what are the key issues I will be covering are, one is the global clout of BIMSTEC, which is growing, and what have been the kind of trade realignments that are happening, and how does that change incentives for cooperation in the region? How necessary is a free trade agreement? Some pointers on that. And then I will talk about what is necessary to really bring about regional value chains, which are in short supply in the region. And then finally, I will conclude with a few closing remarks. Okay, so let me start with talking about the growing clout of BIMSTEC. Right? So, of course, this began in many years ago in 1997. It includes the 7 countries, you all know that, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and then on the East Asia side, Thailand and Myanmar. Right? So, this is an alignment with much potential. Right? So it's helpful in an alignment not to have major political issues, although obviously it's been colored, especially more recently, by the Myanmar, Bangladesh, the refugee issue. But apart from that, between major economies in the region, there are no insurmountable political issues. So I think that's a good thing. India, which is the largest country in the region, for India, this is the least contentious regional grouping. And I think that's a very important point to keep in mind as we go forward. It's also strategically aligned with its Act East policy. It's very promising for its northeastern region, both facilitating this Act East policy of India, which is talking about the connecting India and the BBI and the Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal region to the rest of East Asia, but also so Northeast can both facilitate but also be a beneficiary of such integration. East Asia and Southeast Asia actually now have 25% of India's global trade. So again, underlining how important this grouping could potentially be for the largest country in the region. What is in it for the other countries? For Nepal and Bhutan, it is these landlocked Himalayan nations. It is an opportunity for wider access, right, to the rest of the world, going beyond India and Bangladesh in the region. For Bangladesh, there is possibilities of access to the dynamic Asian market, including through the land route of the northeast region of India. For Myanmar and Thailand, what's in it for them? Well, it's an opportunity to connect with India through the land route and reduce dependence on China. Again, a strategic goal of much of Asian countries, especially the smaller Asian countries, indeed all of them now, and I'll speak more to that. And finally, for Sri Lanka, apart from all the traditional market access issues, there is also an opportunity to become it already is the transshipment hub for India, but it's the opportunity to become the go-to country for transshipment for the entire region and beyond. And I should acknowledge that some of these points I have taken from Anasua Basu Rai Chaudhary's ORF introduction. Okay. The region is growing very fast, and acknowledging Probir Day for this chart. I borrowed this chart from one of his presentations. So the region is growing really fast. It's a growing share of the world economy. Whichever country you look at, right? So in terms, these growth rates are in terms of nominal dollar GDP, compound growth rates, but certainly, there's a mix of East Asian and South Asian countries in this, and these have been traditionally for the last several decades the two fastest growing regions in the world, especially in the last 20 years or so. So there's the BBI, BIMSTEC is occupying a growing share of the world economy, and when that happens, the forces of economic gravity become even more compelling. And what do I mean by economic gravity? Well, there are two. As for those who do understand physics, there is mass into velocity is what the traditional physics equation for energy. Here, the economic energy comes from what gravity. So the mass of GDP, how much is your GDP plus your proximity, so these two are prime movers in how much you trade. And so technically, in theory, compelling logic of economic gravity, and therefore growing a neighborhood such as BIMSTEC, which is growing very fast, brings in compelling logic for economic interchange. Right? That's an important. The growth is important for regional trade, and intra-regional trade has, of course, been growing pretty fast in this region. From it was about less than 5 billion in 2000, and now it's about 46 billion in 2019. Right, so it has been growing very fast, and it's sort of the intra-regional share of the region is about 7% compared to its share in the world trade. And in every country of the region, the share of regional trade has increased. BIMSTEC trade has increased. So let me now talk about, so with this sort of context, let me talk about trade realignments and diversification, and what are some of the global issues here, which bring me to why I think BIMSTEC has a logic, because I think it's rooted in this more than any sort of official cajolements or inducements. Okay, so what's the big picture on trade? There are shifting alignments. So we know there was, so just a few. There's so much going on in world trade. It's a paradise season for trade economists in that sense. But there was everybody knows about Brexit. Britain, leaving the European Union. This deal was sealed in 2020. A major, shift, especially in the Europe region. Then there's the U.S.-China trade war, which started in 2018, and President Biden has certainly signaled his intentions to continue that trade war. And he's holding China's feet to the fire in terms of the phase one trade deal. So this is continuing. Closer to BIMSTEC region, there is the Australia-China spat, which began in a sort of the COVID, in terms of COVID, the inquiry, but then it spilled over into a trade and diplomatic row, and has now, so there's tariff increases in China, the AU-KUS, the AUKUS strategic alignment recently just being announced, which obviously is not something that China looks on very pleasantly. So all of these are happening in the region. So there is a mix of trade and security issues in the region. India has been perhaps one of the first countries in the world to try to decouple from China, right? So it was one of the first to announce. So, banning of applications on websites, changing the rules on FDI and so on. So it has, although there is by no means any actual decoupling happened, but it has at least been trying to decouple from China. And then, of
Sanjay,
course,
you have 3 minutes, Sanjay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then there is the China plus one approach of Japan and many other countries. Okay. So what are the trends that are accelerated by COVID? COVID has accelerated the pressures to diversify and nearshore, right? So countries want to locate nearer home, and some changes on this may be pretty long lasting. So In the face of this, you have also new regional trading arrangements, which is, RCEP in, ASEAN +5, not yet effective, but it exists. Vietnam has been on a spree of signing free trade agreements, and there is the, changing rules of origin in the US-Mexico-Canada arrangement. So I want to say is that is a BIMSTEC, a lot of people talk about a BIMSTEC FTA, and this has not happened, right? Began in 2004. Is it really necessary for alignment or deeper economic cooperation in the region? So there are obviously some intractable issues, for example, India and Thailand, but is this bad news for regional trade, the fact that there is no accomplishment or of an FTA? I don't, not necessarily. Obviously, it's helpful to have an FTA, but FTAs do not necessarily hold up the formation of regional value chains. And the example of the South Asia Free Trade Agreement shows that FTAs do not automatically lead to regional value chains, right? So what do FTAs need? So value chains need, first, they need seamless movement in and out. So in South Asia, especially, tariffs are very high, and they're actually going in the wrong direction in all countries in the region, in every single country, except maybe the smaller ones like Bhutan and Maldives. But, and we know that if you include paratites, the data that I have shown for you is actually is a huge underestimate for Bangladesh and Sri Lanka amongst this group, because if you start including the non-transparent tariffs, then these 12% becomes 24% and 25%, and so on. Okay. So tariffs, if you have high tariffs, then that's not good because it affects the speed of movement. There is uncertainty, and it's really a no-no if you were talking about doing regional value chains, because goods need to cross the borders multiple times if you're going to have regional value chains, right? Value chains also need connectivity. And despite so many years of setting goalposts, the connectivity between the eastern part of BIMSTEC and the western part, has not been great. And there are so many priorities for the region, which have been recounted by many writers over the years. But I think from my own reading, priorities would be the coastal shipping agreement, the connectivity master plan, the trilateral corridor, India, Myanmar, Thailand, and a functional end goal would be a through transit system in the region, land transit system. And I think the Bangladesh-India connectivity in the last 4 or 5 years, the improvements in that show what can be achieved if there is a will, right? So there has been the coastal shipping agreement. There has been the recognition of certification by India of Bangladesh BSTI. There, in 25 odd food products, and there is significant progress in transit arrangements. And finally, also another element which will help value chains is efficiencies in trade processing, as Probir has written a lot on digitizing of trade processes and paperless trading systems, and all of that will help. And of course, you need the private sector to invest in the region, right? So, and I think here Japan can play like it did in East Asia. Japanese FDI, coupled with encouragement from JICA and others, can play a major role in bringing the region together. And there are many examples, just off the top of my head, possibilities of regional value chains: pharma, autos, plastics, garments, digital services, and so on. So finally, concluding, so I think that deeper economic region exchange in the region makes sense for every country involved, as I recounted at the beginning. But the logic of BIMSTEC is economic and not strategic, right? So I think we should disabuse if some people think, oh, that's also a strategic or angle to this, and military drills and all. No, I don't think this is going to cut it. It is an economic dimension, and that's the way it should be focused. Otherwise, all these different focal areas of BIMSTEC, they really lose the value of the mission. And as I assume Arvind Panagaria said yesterday, regional agreements are not a substitute for overall liberalization, right? It's not an either or, but this is where the world is going in the absence of multilateral liberalization. So regional agreements are happening. And I said that, so a big encouragement, the diversification out of China and the nearshoring, the encouragement or the pressures to nearshore, to bring your value chains nearer home because of the disruption of supply chains after COVID, this provides, for me, a deep and underlying rationale for BIMSTEC, more than many other things which have been put forward. And as I said, the possibilities, I've just given a few examples of possibilities in trade, but there is much more, there is energy and services and so on. And then there is deepening connectivity through hard and soft measures, which can unlock all of this potential, including of landlocked countries like Nepal, Bhutan, and India's northeastern region. And all these underlying constraints, even in the absence of an FTA, should be addressed. We should not sort of set up a goal of an FTA and say, oh, that's what we need to do, and therefore we can't make progress on FTA. I would certainly like to leave you with that message that an FTA is neither necessary nor sufficient for deeper economic integration, and the example of SAFTA shows that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. I think there was an excellent beginning of this discussion with your ideas and presentations on the trade and regional integration challenges there, and especially many of these challenges are long-standing. So we'll come back to you during the open discussion, but I just leave two questions for you, probably, which you may elaborate in your second term. One is that about how do you see these things happening under the COVID? So whether you see any change in the kind of pattern. And the second thing is that we have been talking about these regional integration issues, and you have written quite a lot on this. So what are the actually stumbling blocks, and why you are not making significant progress in that? So we'll come back to you. So now let me invite Ambassador Sumit Nakandala, and I have already introduced him very briefly, but glad to see you, Ambassador Nakandala, here in this panel, and he will be talking on re-emerging global order and future of BIMSTEC. Over to you, Ambassador Nakandala.
Good morning, Salim. Thank you very much, Nihal, and our friends. In fact, Sanjay's presentation made my task much easier and answered some of the very important questions with respect to BIMSTEC. I am supposed to speak on emerging global order and the future of BIMSTEC, and I tend to use not the BIMSTEC but Bay of Bengal region. I think that is the geographical nomenclature that we need to focus on. In fact, if we are talking about the future of BIMSTEC as it is. Now, before we indulge in the emerging global order, I think we need also to refresh our minds about the order that we had with respect to the regional cooperation in Asia. My reference basically, as I normally do, a 1947 Asian Relations Conference, where Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru wanted to have his own vision about Asian solidarity and greater cooperation among and between the newly independent countries in Asia and Southeast Asia. Now that that has not gone much further, but it has, I think, laid a solid foundation for regional cooperation and integration processes in the years to come. So one needs to understand what has happened in 1947 and thereafter. In fact, Sri Lanka, country like Sri Lanka, India, we immensely contributed into the non-aligned movement in political terms, and in fact, the non-aligned movement in their subsequent conferences had talked about the new international economic order, new international financial order, and then other related things. Whether that has those ideas have in fact implemented or not, but the ideas have been there in the public domain for the policymakers. Then thereafter we had the Colombo Powers Conference, very political, but in a greater detail they talked about how to develop pan-Asian cooperative and cooperation movement. Then we also have in the old order the Asian version of Marshall Plan, that is Kalam Plan, which Sri Lanka is proud to host the headquarters. So that's the kind of old order. Now, with that old order, we have seen the emergence of new trends. Now, what are these new trends? I think 1965, ASEAN, then 1940, 1985, 84, SARC, to which Sanjay alluded to, and 1997, IORA and BIMSTEC together. So these were the regional arrangements that we have seen as part of the departing from the old order, the order in immediately after the independence. So that's I think it's important. Now, what are the new emerging trends in Asia? I would take a couple of points. One is the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a very important emerging trend. Indo-Pacific Initiative, then Free and Open Indo-Pacific. Then we have Quad, that is India, Japan, Australia, and United States. Then we have very recent, few weeks ago, AUKUS, that is Australia, UK, and US strategic alliance. Now, I remember that Sanjay very specifically said that BIMSTEC is not a strategic institution, or rather arrangement. But I still recall that when we had the first BIMSTEC National Security Advisors meeting in New Delhi in 2017, that declaration, first outcome document, all the 7 countries agreed that to consider Bay of Bengal as a common strategic space. We all agreed on that. Bay of Bengal is a common strategic space, and in order to say that, we have certainly historical evidence. I think those historical evidences have been very vividly documented by our good friend Sunil Amrit in his magnum opus book on crossing the Bay of Bengal. I'm not going into the details what he said, but then I think he has aptly put the historical perspective, at least the early 19th century, the arrival of European through armed chartered companies, using the direction of winds across the Bay of Bengal. And one important example is how many Western powers were competing each other in the Coromandel Coast. I mean, from the French to Danish to Portuguese to Dutch to all the players were there in the Bay of Bengal. So that's important. Now, the new trends, I have just brief. We don't have time to. I mean, I would like to keep some time for the discussion. If any question, if anybody wants to ask a question. Now, by 2022, that is next year, BIMSTEC is completing 25 years. We have 14 areas of cooperation. And as Sanjay said, we have been discussing this myself, Professor Mr. Futsur, and then Salim, then with Prabir, and then how do we accomplish the economic integration, unfinished agenda of economic integration and cooperation in the Bay of Bengal. I think to most of us, maybe with the exception to Sanjay, whenever we talk about economic integration and cooperation, we still have the Bella Balasas 4-stage theory. That is where we are stuck. But I'm glad that Sanjay brought important component which I wanted to relate, that is the connectivity. Now, as he said, immediately after 1997, we established the BIMSTEC as an organization. 2004, we started talking about economic cooperation, and 21 rounds of trade negotiating team meetings held, but then we don't see anywhere that accomplishment of BIMSTEC FTA, not only trading goods, trading services, custom cooperation and investment chapters. We have been parallelly, unlike other FTAs, we have been parallelly negotiating this. Now, what is the role of BIMSTEC in the recently concluded RCEP? Sanjay also mentioned about RCEP. We were also thinking about that route at some point of time, but then we have not been successful. We have RCEP, yes, and at our doorstep, near to the Bay of Bengal. Then we have CPTPP and China's interest in joining this comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, these are instruments that we need to look into. These are new trends emerging just adjacent to the Bay of Bengal region. Two important things which Sanjay said that I would like to reiterate, that the importance of implementing as early as possible BIMSTEC connectivity. Again, there is an important instrument that we need to implement as early as possible, that is BIMSTEC grid interconnection plan, the power interconnection plan. This is also important. Now, when we face with the new trends, should we talk about the holistic nature of the Bay of Bengal? I think so. I think we need to seriously think of eastward expansion of the organization, that Bay of Bengal. I'm suggesting, and where I have elsewhere said that.
3 minutes.
Yeah, I'm
Around
coming
3
to
minutes.
I'm coming to them. So I'm thinking, suggesting that we also need to ponder over whether there is a role for Malaysia and Indonesia in Bay of Bengal integration process. And also, not disturbing, but important part of connectivity. Few weeks ago, there was news that which you would have read, the Chinese high-speed railway from Kunming had come to the border of Myanmar and China. That's in Yunnan province. Now, the idea is, can it come to the Bay of Bengal? That's important connectivity, which we need to think. Finally, some couple of thoughts. Sanjay also mentioned briefly. Next chair of BIMSTEC is Thailand. Important thing, as the First Secretary General, I also realized that, and I said it's a fact that BIMSTEC is a member-driven organization, unlike the secretariat-driven organization. Now, we try to do something. We try to do a hybrid, giving the supremacy to the member states, saying that organization is member-driven, but secretariat also needs to have a kind of say. Some of the proposals that Sanjay was talking about, coastal shipping agreement and trade facilitation agreement, those were the proposals from the secretariat, and I'm very grateful to a few of my friends in the audience who had supported me in doing that. So finally, now how do we succeed in BIMSTEC as a regional organization? If the FTA is not possible, what else is possible? That was our question. Now that question I asked again and again after the collapse of TNC meeting in Bangkok. So what is possible? Connectivity, is it possible? Can the connectivity bring or increase the regional integration? Can the trade facilitation do that? Can the coastal shipping agreement? All other things, what is possible we need to do. In order to do that, certainly, very important prerequisite, that is the political leadership. Now, we need to ask this question. What is the cost of non-cooperation? As the European Union asked that. Can we ask that, and can we pose this question in the Bay of Bengal? What is the cost of non-cooperation? Not necessarily, I mean, I have no argument with the thesis to say that FTA is a must and necessary, because now the emerging trend, as Sanjay also explained, even yesterday, from Panagaria, connectivity becomes the most important. It is not only the connectivity which is the physical connectivity, the digital connectivity, the connecting the minds of the people across the Bay of Bengal. I think that's the most important thing, provided that the right political leadership is given to BIMSTEC as a regional organization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sumit Nakandala. I think it was an excellent deliberation, especially you highlighted some of these very pragmatic, I think, issues. Given the context that many things are not really moving forward. So what could be the alternative ideas and what could be the way forward? Thank you so much, and definitely we'll come back to you during the open discussion session. I request participants, and we have actually widespread participation from this region, to post their comments or questions in the chat box. So I will definitely try to use your insights and have your insights during the open discussion session. So now let me invite Dr. Indrajit Kumarasamy, and I have already briefly introduced him, so I'm not getting into that. So Dr. Indrajit Kumarasamy will be talking on, there is a little bit change in the topic, so he'll be talking on prospects of Indo-Sri Lanka relations under this new geopolitical setting. So over to you, Dr. Kumarasamy.
On the original topic, Salim, so maybe I'll do that and then give make some remarks on Indo-Sri Lanka relations as well. In terms of the macroeconomic stress of COVID and recovery, I think it's fair to say that the unprecedented policy actions of central banks and governments has prevented far worse outcomes, induced shocks. That is not to say that MSMEs, women, children in education have not gone through a terrible, dramatic, in fact, in some instances, setbacks in terms of their lives and livelihoods. But things could have been far worse. Central banks provided liquidity and supported credit flows in various ways to an array of market participants. Fiscal stimulus took the form of relief to households and firms through income transfers, wage subsidies, and liquidity support. Safety nets were bolstered through unemployment benefits and nutrition support. And it was, I think, very useful that for many emerging markets and commodity exporters, the exchange rate appreciated against the US dollar at the height of the crisis in 2020. So all this served to limit the amplification of the shock. In fact, the IMF estimates that but for the policy actions, which included automatic stabilizers, discretionary measures, and financial sector interventions, the contraction of global growth would have been 3 times greater. So what about prospects for recovery? The title of the July WEO, the World Economic Outlook of the IMF, says that fault lines are widening. And the fault lines are widening along the vaccine access theme. Vaccinated countries are expected to normalize economic activity in the 4th quarter of this year. Unvaccinated countries could experience new waves of infections and rising deaths. Even vaccinated countries are not out of the woods as long as the virus keeps circulating widely and new variants could emerge. Now, in terms of a baseline, projections. For the global economy contracted by 3.2% in 2020. It's expected to grow by 6% this year and by 4.9% next year. Advanced economies contracted by 4.6% last year, growth of 5.6% this year and 4.4% next year. Emerging markets and developing economies contracted by 2.1% last year, and they're expected to grow by 6.3% this year and 5.2% next year. So that's basically the baseline. And as far as world trade is concerned, it contracted by 8.5% last year. It's expected to grow by 8.4% this year and 6.5% next year. And the WTO recently announced that in fact, global trade has in fact just exceeded the pre-pandemic levels. So there has been a reasonable bounce back this year. Again, very uneven, and vaccine access has been a determinant of the path of the recovery. Now, it's interesting that the performance of emerging markets and developing economies has shown considerable resilience in the face of the COVID-19 shock. Growth did turn negative for most of them last year, but large-scale financial meltdowns of previous crises did not materialize this time. And here the US Fed's decision and its decisive action has been extremely helpful. The interest rate cuts, the QE, the macroprudential easing, and direct credit support, all that has given pretty good support to the world economy, and things have not fallen down, particularly in terms of a financial meltdown. Things have not been as bad as they could have been, though of course the health shock and the scarring of lives, particularly of those in vulnerable livelihoods, has been quite considerable. Now, what are some of the risks to the baseline? In terms of uncertainties, the two overarching uncertainties are: one, the path of the pandemic, and two, the related point of the vaccine availability. In addition, there are a number of downside risks. In addition to these uncertainties, there are a number of downside risks. The most significant is probably persistent inflation. I'll say a bit more about this later. Also, we may be moving to a less supportive financial conditions. And we are beginning to see a tightening of sovereign yields in the major countries, particularly the US. Then there's rising commodity prices, which clearly are good for some countries, a challenge to others. The repricing of financial assets, this could cause problems for leveraged firms and households. Bankruptcies could undermine bank capital buffers and affect their capacity to provide credit. And the extensive scarring of the economy. Policy action has limited this scarring, but part of the pandemic would still lead to persistent damage to supply potential and employment, depending on the path of the pandemic. Now, if I may now move to some of the geopolitical, trade, and technology risks. Clearly, the geopolitical risks, particularly in US-China tensions, has become elevated. The formation of AUKUS and the Quad on the one side, and China's actions in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the South China Sea on the other, South China Sea on the other, have contributed to this elevation of tensions, and it's unlikely to abate anytime soon. On the trade front, domestic compulsions stemming from the pandemic could result in new trade barriers, which are motivated by the need to protect domestic workers. And the Huawei case is emblematic of the protectionist tensions surrounding technology. So on all these fronts, there are tensions which could pose downside risks to the recovery. Let me say a little bit more about the inflation threat, which is arguably the most significant of the risks to the recovery. Recent inflationary pressures are thought to be transitory due to the mismatch caused by the surge in pent-up demand supported by increase in savings and the supply constraints that have been created by disruptions in supply chain. However, the inflation could become persistent if there is prolonged supply disruptions. Now, the emblematic case here are the chips, the shortage of chips, which is affecting a number of industries. Another risk comes from commodity and real estate price shocks, the longer term expenditure commitments that have been made, which may be difficult to unwind, and eventually a de-anchoring of inflation expectations, which could trigger wage pressure. So there are a number of things bubbling up beneath the surface, which could result in inflation becoming persistent. And some of the doomsayers, doomsday merchants, think that the worst case scenario is that we could end up with stagflation. So I personally don't think we're going to go in that direction, but it is possible that inflation could become entrenched in a way it hasn't been now for many years. One may conclude that the key drivers of inflation are: one, the pickup in economic activity and closing of the output gap. IMF and analysis has found that the relationship between the output gap and inflation continues to remain strong. A second factor is the rapidly increasing commodity price since the beginning of the pandemic. And this is clearly very significant for our region, where the share of food in the consumption basket is high. And historically, when you look at the pattern of inflation, there are some turning points that can be identified. And historically, the acceleration of inflation has been preceded by increases in the fiscal and current account deficits. And it has also been associated with sharp exchange rate depreciation. So that's on inflation. Now, let me just turn to the kind of tightening of financial conditions. Now, financial conditions are expected to be broadly supportive for emerging markets and developing economies going forward. However, there are, again, risks surrounding this scenario. Financial conditions would depend on the path of inflation and inflation expectations in advanced countries, especially the US, and the impact it has on the trajectory of monetary policy in those countries. Again, the Fed's actions will be particularly significant. When global financial conditions tighten, there can be significant movement in asset prices, that's equities, corporate bonds, etc. It can also impact on commodity prices and capital flows, all of which can buffet the economies of emerging markets and developing economies. And dollar strength would be another ramification that can have implications for countries in our region. It is a powerful factor driving both the global financial cycle and the EMDE business cycle. The key channels through which dollar strength affects EMDEs is through the negative association with global trade and its impact on real commodity prices. Let me now turn to the financing needs of EMDEs.
Dr.
The gross
Kumar,
financing.
you have 3 minutes.
Thank you.
Around 3 minutes, yeah.
Fine, thank you. The gross financing needs of EMDEs, that's fiscal deficits plus maturing government debt, is very high. The IMF projects that these would be at double-digit percentages of GDP for many of them. Fiscal deficits are expected to decline as revenue increases and crisis-related expenditure unwinds with the recovery after the pandemic. However, debt servicing will be higher due to the debt which has been incurred during the pandemic. This will have an impact on the capacity to address rising poverty, growing inequality, and the setback in human capital accumulation during the crisis. So preparation should be made to strengthen mechanisms to provide liquidity to EMDEs, and in the cases of where there is insolvency, there should be mechanisms for restructuring sovereign debt. Now, in this connection, there are a couple of mechanisms which seem to be low-hanging fruit. One is, we recently had a general SDR allocation by the IMF of $650 billion. Now, the SDRs allocated to the advanced countries who have less of a need for such liquidity infusion could be channeled into what the IMF has proposed as a resilience and sustainability trust. So I think there is a strong case for reallocating those SDRs. And where
become muted.
You're muted, Dr. Kumarasamy.
where solvency challenges have become more acute, the mechanisms for restructuring debt among EMDCs needs to be strengthened. And there is a case for going beyond the G20's common framework for debt treatments in this regard. In addition, the IMF proposal for a USD 50 billion facility jointly endorsed by the World Bank, WTO, and WHO should be passed and approved as quickly as possible. Now, I've talked a lot about uncertainties and downside risks. Let me identify a couple of upside risks. And one is the expected vaccination and production and rollout. If that goes better than expected, clearly that would be a very strong upside. As well as unanticipated larger multiplier effects of fiscal support. There's been this tremendous amount of fiscal support that has been pushed out by governments around the world. And if there are unanticipated multiplier effects, I think that will also give a boost to the recovery. And finally, better than expected international coordination and cooperation. That could also, again, strengthen the recovery. So what are some of the priorities for exiting the crisis in terms of the decisions of policymakers? One is health and education spending, and support for MSMEs should be prioritized. Two is fiscal and monetary policy support should be calibrated to the evolution of the pandemic, and central banks should be proactive in terms of taking the punch bowl away if they see the economy recovering and the growth and growth potential being fulfilled. Three, macroprudential policies should be used to contain the financial system stability, and build back better should mean build back greener and with reduced disparity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kumarasamy. I think, given the current context, especially the challenges we are having during COVID-19 and the recovery process, the kind of suggestion you have made will be extremely important. We'll come back to you, but I'll just leave one question for you, and then probably you can elaborate that one later. You talked about this fiscal support and the stimulus packages, and which have been given by many of these countries in this part of this region. But there is a challenge of the distribution of the stimulus package too, especially there are complaints or allegations of many sectors, or particularly you have talked about SMEs not being able to getting the benefit of the stimulus package. And SMEs, they perform very important role in the whole supply chain. So how do you see the kind of recovery process, if this stimulus package's distribution or its effectiveness is not really being, enhanced?
Sure.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to answer anything on Indo-Lanka relations as well. And Sumit is the expert there. Sumit is also, I think, better qualified than I, but I'd be happy to answer any questions on that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Kumar. So we'll come back to you. Now, let me invite Dr. Mustafizur Rahman, and I have already introduced him. So Dr. Rahman, he will be talking on this regional and global value chain during this COVID era. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Salim. Thank you, Nihal, for this opportunity to share some of my views on a very important subject, which is of great interest and also big concern for us who try to follow the developments in the Bay of Bengal region. And I would like to appreciate the initiative of the three co-organizers, very timely initiative. And I think that for the audience who are with us today, it will be, I think, of immense value. We have heard from our three very distinguished panelists, Sanjoy, Sumit, and Indrajit. Between them, they have really put the discourse in the context and also provided some very useful insights in going forward. Now, I was asked to look at the regional and global value chains and how these were impacted by the pandemic and how to go forward in the context of the Bay of Bengal region. Now, if we look at the value chains, these are dependent on various connectivities. Obviously, the trade connectivity is the apex, but down that we have the investment connectivity, the transport connectivity, the logistics connectivity, and the people-to-people connectivity. Now, if I take the COVID, then obviously the transmission channels of the COVID also impacted on these connectivities. You see, the transport connectivity was disrupted, the investment connectivity was disrupted, logistics and trade facilitation was disrupted, and obviously travel disrupted the people-to-people connectivity. And we get the accumulation of disruption in the trade connectivity because of the COVID pandemic. Now, if to give you some data, if we take the BIMSTEC region, in 2019, the import of goods was 79 billion, and it came down to 64 billion, 19% negative growth during the COVID times, if we take 2020 as a COVID time. Goods export also came down from $63 billion to $55 billion, another 12%. If you take services, there also we see 13% decline in export and 21% decline in import of services. If we take tourist arrivals, it came down from 60.9 million to 13.7, a 77.5% decline. So that's how the COVID impacted export and import of goods and services and tourist services as well. So obviously for the economies of the region, Bay of Bengal region, it had tremendous negative impact. Now, from the perspective of value chains, we see that because the global value chains and the regional value chains were also negatively impacted, one lesson, and if I can formulate my presentation as learnings from the COVID experience, lessons for Bay of Bengal region. From that perspective, I think what Sanjoy has also very rightly mentioned, that one lesson is that we will have to develop the regional value chains, and other panelists also mentioned about the connectivities which are there. So I think that we should not be hostage to the FTA, but if we can have our own suo motu liberalization, then the other connectivities, investment connectivity and transport connectivity, people-to-people connectivity can lead to more trade connectivity, even if we don't have FTA. So that was the message that Sanjay wanted to transmit, and I agree. And yesterday also in his excellent presentation, Professor Panagria also was mentioning in those respects. But at the same time, I also must also add that whether a more closer integrated FTA or comprehensive economic partnership amongst the countries of the Bay of Bengal can far accelerate what we can do without a SEPA or an FTA. So I think that from that perspective, the issue of FTA becomes very important. Also, because we have seen that during the COVID pandemic, how not only that the transport connectivities were disrupted, but also we have to keep in mind that during the COVID, three things, I think. One is that there was no synchronization between the supply side and demand side. We saw various COVID waves. So when Bangladesh was exporting to the United States or Europe, we found out that, for example, we were coming out of the COVID, but there was second wave and demand side constraint in the major markets. When they were coming out, we had our second wave. So I think that lack of synchronization, if we take from the global value chain perspective, is also one reason that we should have more deeper regional connectivity where the patterns and trends appear to be the same. So I think this is very important. Second is that we are seeing a rise in fuel prices. When we are coming out of the COVID, we are seeing rise, 300-400% rise in transport costs. So I think that regional value chains can also be important in terms of taking advantage of the closer transport linkages that we are now developing. So I think that many of the ingredients are there. We are, in spite of the developments in the BIMSTEC may be frustrating, but I think that the ingredients could be building blocks for more deepened trade, investment, and transport, these three triangulation, which can allow us to translate our comparative advantages into competitive advantages. So I think that export diversification, market diversification, and development of regional value chains are really closely entwined. And I think that this is a great opportunity. If you look at what are the export potentials of our region, within the Bay of Bengal region, you will see that any exercise, and I have done some, lot of opportunities for each of our countries. And yesterday, Professor Panigre made a very insightful comment, and which was that, you see the pie is increasing. So, and he was giving us the information about how over the last 20 years, there has been a rise in the global trade by, about 3 times. So the pie is increasing. So I think that we can take advantage of this growing, potentials that are emerging in the Bay of Bengal region. Now, from that perspective, I think that we will also have to understand that the current trade pattern in our country's export pattern, if I take Bangladesh ready-made garment sector, for example, is very much dependent on the global brands and global buyers. It's a buyer-driven value chain. And we have seen during the time of COVID, how higher discounts were demanded, orders were cancelled. There were high pressure on prices. So in order to maintain their relationship with the buyers, entrepreneurs were trying to maintain the relationship, but at a very high cost. So I think that the sectors that Sanjay also mentioned, pharmaceutical, auto, plastics, which would need a lot of to and fro. If we can deepen regional integration in the Bay of Bengal region, I think that there are tremendous opportunities of developing the production networks in order to develop the regional value chains. And nearshoring, I think, will become a very important aspect. And in one of the recent articles, Nihal also mentioned with regard to Sri Lanka, what are the transmission mechanisms and how to go forward, what type of policies to pursue. So from that perspective, I think that we should also look at the policies that we should pursue. Our own liberalization of tariffs, which also was mentioned by Sanjay, but also I think that more negotiation, developing the negotiating capacities, offensive and defensive interests with regard to building the trade blocks, I think will become very important. As we go forward, I think
Raman,
that
you have 3 minutes around.
Oh, okay, fine. As we go forward, as I was mentioning, the triangulation of trade, investment, and connectivities, which we are now building, will become very important. And also, I think that when we talk about that, the SAFTA was not very helpful, etc. But within the SAFTA also, the sub-regional value chain, sub-regional connectivity, these are also becoming very important. And also, don't forget that although we didn't have deeper liberalization within SAFTA, but India gave the 4 least developed countries zero tariff access to the Indian market. So I think that we can also take not only think about the regional perspective, but also sub-regional perspective. And for me, developing the regional value chain is also important because 3 of the 7 BIMSTEC members are also graduating members. Bhutan will be graduating in 2023 and Bangladesh and Nepal will be graduating in 2026. How do we make the crucial transition from preferential market access based competitiveness to productivity and skills based competitiveness? I think that challenge for these 3 graduating LDCs also gives a more reinforced argument to deepen regional value chains and regional production networks. So I think that we can identify, one can go into deeper into those. It's not that I am arguing for not going for global value chains, but also regional value chains. I'm telling that, as Professor Panigre said, the pie is becoming bigger. This is not if one or the other. We can take advantage of the bigger regional markets, as Vietnam is the best example. It's a member, it has signed EU, Vietnam FTA, it will get zero tariff access for many items in the European Union. It is a member of CPTPP, it will get zero tariff access in the market of Canada. It is a member of RCEP, it will get zero tariff access in China and Japan and Australia. Where will these three graduating LDCs of the region be in competing with Vietnam after 2026? So I think that the pie is getting greater, and regional value chains can give us access to the regional markets, and it can be building block also for strengthened global value chain integration. I think that is also very important. And last point, Salim, if you give me half a minute, which is that I think the Bay of Bengal itself is also a major source of potential benefit for all of our countries. So if we can cooperate, and if we can explore and exploit in a peaceful manner, I always say that in Bangladesh, we should not think that it is a 144 square kilometer country. We should add our 118 square kilometer in the Bay of Bengal, and we should say that our territory is 262,000 square kilometers. Our mindset will have to be developed along those ways, and other countries in the region also. I think that's a big opportunity that awaits us, but unexplored and unexploited as of now. And last point is, we should also, the MC12 Ministerial Conference of the WTO is coming 30th November to 3rd December. I think that our regional countries should project a common front in the global platforms also, so that we can maximize the benefits that we can accrue from the global system as well. So with those words, I would like to conclude, Salim. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Professor Mustafizur Rahman. I think it's an excellent deliberation, especially I think your deliberation and what Sanjay presented at the beginning actually complemented each other, especially the emphasis on the trade policy and regional and global value chain. So I leave a question for you, and probably Sanjay can also even come to responding it while in the open discussion session. Especially when you talk about using the regional value chain and also integration with the global value chain, because they are quite interlinked. Because in many, as we know that you have talked about these three graduating LDCs, many of these countries of this region, they export outside of the region, but they can use the regional value chain actually to integrate more in the global value chain. So to what extent their own trade policy is actually helpful, or favorable, when it comes to integration. And also, Professor Rahman, you in the past also talked quite a lot about these non-tariff issues, non-tariff measures, and the escalation of this, and lack of capacity to comply with these non-tariff measures. So I think in the second round, if you can come back with some responses, that would be really great. Now it is my pleasure to invite Dr. Swanee Magle, a very good friend of us. Swanee, over to you. And he will be talking on energy cooperation and clean energy, and also you can add something based on so far you have heard so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim, and very pleased to join this distinguished panel. I wanted to speak on clean energy and enhancing energy cooperation in the region, the BIMSTEC region, largely because the COP26 is coming. Almost all the countries in the region, Asia-Pacific region more broadly, are now in a progressive fashion, committing themselves to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, 2060. So against that backdrop, I think this is an agenda that BIMSTEC should be taking up very actively. It could be a standalone agenda, energy cooperation, or it could be subsumed under a broader, deeper trade and investment frameworks with which all of us are much more familiar with, right? So let me start with the economic foundations for trade in energy. I think they are solid. All economists talk about the basis for trade as being the differences in endowments. And here it's so stark, right? So Nepal and Bhutan very much hydro dominated. Nepal has 83 gigawatts of potential in hydropower generation alone. Current utilization is just 1 gigawatt. Bhutan per capita income consumption is higher, but still a hydro-dominated. India-Bhutan cooperation has already gone a long way. India very much reliant on coal and a little bit of hydro. Myanmar is hydro plus gas. Bangladesh is largely gas. Thailand is largely gas with hydro imported from Lao, PDR, and elsewhere. Sri Lanka, hydro is almost exploited, and it has gone into this innovative solar home grid connections. So, you know, the endowments differ, and that forms a very, very compelling basis for trade. And then the per capita consumption is also very divergent. So trade, as we all know, allows gains from specialization on technology mix, as well as to minimize the total cost of generation, right? If Nepal wanted to go it alone, the costs would be much higher, and already the penalty associated with landlockness is adding to the cost of doing business, cost of trade, etc. So, you know, this is very much a cost minimization strategy as well. Now, there are some technical nudges for cooperation. There's a technical issue of grid synchronization. Nepal imports 500 megawatts of electricity from India right now. In the future, we hope to export much more, but right now we are importing massive electricity in a radial mode. Bangladesh imports another 100 megawatts or so in a radial mode. The northern grid of India is actually dissociated from the rest of the Indian grid. So, you know, this very important technical issue of synchronization between grids connected by AC lines. That is a very much a technical argument for enhancing energy cooperation as we go forward. And the entry of renewable energy over the next decade or so is also providing the impetus for enhanced energy cooperation. Stronger regional grid connectivity indirectly increases the inertia of regional grid compared to national grid, and so you know, just to enhance transient power system stability. Also, this is very much this needs to be on the agenda of enhancing energy cooperation in our region. Now, the third set of points I want to make briefly is on the development merits. Is very much compelling, of course. SDG 7, talking about energy for all, you know, cheap, reliable, modern forms of energy, accessible to everyone. That's very much there. But in the aftermath of COVID, in the post-pandemic development priorities, again, net zero carbon emissions, the displacement of these dirty sources of fuel is very much going to be a priority for us. So how do we move ahead? I think the first is to really, we need to do a better job. All the think tanks are the analytical work on the gains from trade, right? So we have some theoretical suppositions, but there was this work done by USAID Regional Project on Energy, which I found very, very convincing, with very rigorous sort of CG modeling on how the gains will accrue to the countries in the region based on these differing endowments. And that was, I think we need to do a better job in educating the public on making a stronger case for enhanced energy cooperation. We've done this for trade, but we haven't made too much progress. Perhaps energy is something much more tangible, much more universal. You know, the benefits are going to be spread much more widely, and perhaps that will bring the political consensus and the capital to move ahead. Trade, I guess, has been very much a topic that has been, I mean, of course, the consumers benefit, but the lobbyists and everything has been very, very, very concentrated. So we need to advance technical cooperation on many of these things that I just mentioned: grid synchronization, scope for optimum energy dispatch, and also a need for an integrated master plan. Right? This is very much a technical issue, but we need to depoliticize it. A lot of the Nepalese hydro potentials were stagnated for almost 50 years because we were debating whether it is even worth talking with India about trading energy. This was associated with nationalism, etc. But that debate was settled, has been settled now, particularly with the cross-border trade really helping end crippling blackout in Nepal. I think we need to advance trust amongst a few countries, set of countries through early harvest. So the load shedding ending in Nepal through this import of Indian electricity led very much to that heightening of goodwill and an impetus for greater collaboration. So the Arun hydropower projects in eastern Nepal, very much off the ground with Indian Satluj investments coming in that will be completed in a few years. Again, these are projects that were deeply politicized in the past, but it's on the basis of this goodwill as a result of early harvests of concrete, tangible results that this agenda has been able to we've been able to advance. Right. There's also a very compelling case for addressing seasonal imbalances, right? So Nepal has gone, and we need to redress this very, very aggressively in the ROR direction, the run of the river thing, which means that in the summer we have almost surplus energy. In the winter, in the lean seasons, when there is not enough rain, our installed capacity for electricity generation plummets by almost more than half. Right now, you look at India; it's a larger economy. But they also have a seasonal imbalance, but it's almost daily variation. So the demand for peak power in India is immense. You take a month like November, the peak power demand is at 7 o'clock at night. It lasts for only 1 hour. You take the summer under the crippling heat, the peak power starts at 8. Demand for peak power starts at 8 p.m., lasts until midnight, right? So that kind of a very segmented hour by hour demand for peak power can be provided by the hydro facilities in Nepal, in Bhutan, in Arunachal Pradesh, in the northern parts of India, not just for the northern parts of India, but increasingly with Bangladesh also. And there's a lot of talk in recent days, weeks, actually, to enhance that cooperation. But Indian assistance is essential, right? So I think, and finally, let me say that a lot of the energy issues, I think, can be now brought in to the new generation of trade and investment treaties. So we are all familiar with, from the 90s and the 2000s, with GATS, and there's a lot of negotiations that has happened under the WTO on the General Agreement on Trade and Services, a lot of commitments made, a lot of offers made on energy, trade in energy services, but not much has come out of it. These are all sort of positive list commitments, and that haven't led to any concrete results. So perhaps through BIMSTEC, through SARC, through BBIN, these other forums, we should be advancing this agenda in a much more constructive direction. And I think COVID and this whole heightened emphasis on climate change really allows us to go back to the basics on why we should be trading in the first place, right? And energy cooperation, again, tangible, the endowments vary, the consumptions vary, a classic case for taking advantage of gains from specialization. So let me stop there, and I'm sorry I have to rush off. Any questions I'll take maybe later on. Thank you, Salim.
Thank you, Swarnee, an excellent deliberation, of course. And this is a genuine area for cooperation, and we have been talking about this energy cooperation for years. But and also you talked about some large-scale investment is needed and why this is not really happening. As per the expectation, that's a big issue, definitely. And I think since this project is actually involving some of the leading policymakers from different ministries of this region, for the next 11 months, I think, Swanee, it will be great, if this issue, we can actually bring up this issue for larger discussion at a certain point of time. Thank you so much, Swanee. So let me invite our final panelist today is Professor Sutipant Kirativat from Chulalongkorn University, Thailand. So Professor Sutipant, he will be talking, he will be actually sharing his experience from ASEAN and dealing with the COVID-19 and the ASEAN BIMSTEC cooperation. Over to you, Professor Sutipant.
Thank you, Chair Ryan, and good late morning to everybody, and some maybe in other part of the world. A very great pleasure to be in this important panel expert. And today, I think very much we're looking forward for this first round of discussion. I hope very useful. Topic given to me on the what do you call ASEAN experience with COVID-19, and we're looking also at the ASEAN Bimstec Cooperation, which in fact get me straight into the two parts. The first part I will address about the ASEAN experience with COVID-19, and then the second part I will look at the cooperation ASEAN with the Bimstec. Of course, I hope that my talk will be useful for the rest of the discussion. ASEAN, you know, if you look at ASEAN overall, it's different from other parts of the world, has strongly, you know, been impacted very much by COVID-19, and almost now we're talking about 2 years since an outbreak in Wuhan, and also, you know, the Thailand. In official record, it's the first woman tourist from Wuhan as a tourist, you know, coming in January last year. And since, of course, last year, pretty much, you know, that despite the total lockdown, you know, that we all experienced the first COVID lockdown, total lockdown mostly. And we will, of course, come out pretty fine, you know, quite good student, not much kids. Except some countries in ASEAN, you know, but particularly the maritime ASEAN, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and to a certain extent, Singapore, there have been more impact rather than mainland ASEAN. But this year is totally different once, you know, the Delta variant come into the picture, and particularly from the second quarter and up to now. So the past more than 6 months now that we very much have much more cases compared to the last year. And that's how the kind of thing that we living on. So that's bring me to 3 issues to talk about the experience of COVID. First, about the shock and impact. The second issue on recovery. And the last thing on rebuilding our ASEAN, you know, the post-COVID ASEAN, what would that be? First issue, let me go straight to start with the shock and impact. I guess it's, as we know, no country, no place in this globalized world is safe from the pandemic. ASEAN is no different in that regard, because ASEAN is so open, you know, that's, and that's why the COVID also not just strong, devastating, shock, and impacts, even never seen in our living memory. Of course, we are very much hopeful that something, you know, that's been recovery, but of course, it's not such a case. Beyond health crisis, it's also caused disruption, I would say, multiple disruption. We're talking about the connectivity disruption, trade disruption, and many kind of disruption to every aspect of life and society. So very much, I think this exercise, very first question that comes to very much a discussion last year is about the painful exercise between health and economy and society, how to keep the balance between the two. So this is an issue. If you give too much the voice to the expert and the doctor, so they said, well, you better save the country, you know, not letting in people in, the border should be closed. On the other hand, if the border closed, like ASEAN so open, be quite impacted by that kind of thing. So if we move into this year, I think the voice is different. Even, you know, that we have living a downward economy last year, and last year growth not as quite, you know, if you take the macro impact on our economy, we all got the minus growth, except perhaps the Vietnam is because of the strong growth of 8%, they reduced to around 2%. But a severe lockdown that we learned, that we said we should not repeat this year. So this year is very much more, what do you call, we would like to imply more kind of the partial lockdown, you know, here and there, whenever it's represent, you know. So this is something that I think is very important. Despite the Delta variant, it becomes strong, you know. And this is something that we need to think about it. Of course, very much on the way also, we've been recovery, and this kind of recovery, what we would not be able to looking very much if we not looking before. Of course, the pre-COVID, you think that the ASEAN as a whole this year, we expect perhaps a 2% growth, which is below, I think, because we are open. So that's why the impact quite strong. Have you taken the Myanmar case? This is the latest ADB report with a contraction of minus 18.4% because of the triple crisis, political crisis, COVID crisis, and also economic crisis. So that's strong. We could come back to talk later on. In between, of course, the government, we're talking about the central bank, fiscal policy, all the macro policy try to elevate it. But of course, they don't be able to do everything. The household still suffer. We're talking about SME quite suffer. The whole business sector, they all asking for help. So that's something that we need to keep on while we make into the recovery. What recovery, when we come to the second issue about recovery, what we're talking about is recovery also means building back on track. That and if we think it, I think is this round of recovery will be quite different from other crises we used to know. So there's something, and I have two examples in mind to make it simple and more concrete on recovery on connectivity. One is about the people movement. We're talking about the travel. What to recover is not yet clear, still a lot of risk and uncertainty because the travel industry, now they're talking, okay, next year, 2022, 23, 24, we will come back. Look, example of Thailand, my country, which in fact had total international travelers, plummet from 40 million travelers, and half of that travelers coming from intra-ASEAN travelers to just less than 100,000, as of now, so 400 times less. So it's really represent, the tourists is at 12% of Thailand GDP. And you can imagine they come up with a figure of 4.3 million employed in this sector. So 71% or around 3 million become unemployed because of the COVID, you can imagine. And the kind of, if you amplify by looking at the kind of people to connectivity being reduced to almost zero. So this is something forgotten. And it's something that we need to rebuild. What to recover is, of course, they have been very much working at the individual country, but more effort at the regional level. We start to talk more about the regional coordination effort. The other example, perhaps on the brighter side of COVID, is a digital change, a digital connectivity with the lockdown. We have not been able to talk much, but I think digital technology, digital transformation, we have the ASEAN 4.0, been talking for some time. So like this meeting, Zoom, you're obliged to use this kind of technology instead of the physical presence. And things go on for work from home, the hybrid work, online education, to many things. But of course, not everyone had the access to the kind of technology. So that's something to talk about. And one aspect, perhaps also on the brighter side, of course, people, when they log home, what they do for shopping, so e-commerce and other kind of thing become into picture. So this e-commerce trade moving from last year around 62 billion, US dollar in ASEAN to 100 billion this year, and they expect to increase 5 times in 2025. So without COVID, we might be able to see such a transformation, I would say. So that brings me to the third point about rebuilding post-pandemic ASEAN. And I think very important
Professor Supipand,
about the
you have
ASEAN.
around 3 minutes.
Could be maybe 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay, sure,
Okay.
sure, please.
Yeah,
please.
okay. So maintaining what ASEAN they're doing well, I think it is ASEAN, that's very important to look at the 3 pillars of ASEAN community. We've been very much open, as I said, and we keep the principle of being resilient, inclusive, sustainable, and people-oriented for our future building. And of course, the term that comes into rebuilding is about new normal and next normal. I would translate into the transformation forced and supported or not by this virus, and had definitely strong implication for us to think about the future building or ASEAN integration. No doubt that, of course, perhaps the world we live will ever look the same again. So that's why we need to interpret this transformation about this new and next normal that we move into, and even for whatever the ASEAN or Brimstone. For ASEAN regional integration, I think it will not substantially change our trajectory, our integration, because if you remember, we were talking about we moving, that in the 90s when we stamped out the first FTA, the ASEAN FTA, which is about the 10 pages of agreement. It's just said it's agree first and talk later. That's reserved about this trade agreement. So it's important to have that kind of agreement first, and then by the mid-90s, the second half of 90s, we allow CMLV country, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, and Myanmar to picture, once we reconstruct into 10 ASEAN. So this is something about the asymmetrical trade liberalization. We allow them to enjoy first the kind of the FTA of the 6, and then the later member can come in. So I think this is a kind of thing of accommodating the new members, which they very important to consider at the time. Of course, by the change of 2000, we have more FTA with the outside, with India, with China, with Australia, New Zealand, with Japan and Korea. All this is important step that we move into before we stemming out the ASEAN Charter. ASEAN Charter is also a very important step for legal personality of ASEAN in 2009 when we all ratified, and we started community building, the 3 pillars, by 2016. And of course, along the way, the 54 years of ASEAN, if you come in today, is very much still we call work in progress, and we try to adapt and adopt what is necessary to moving the region forward. I would already have, we don't have time, that's looking at very much about these important challenges of what do you call the next new normal. I think at least 4 issues, if they have to do with ASEAN Vision 2025. I think is the health crisis change the perception of well-being of ASEAN, and we need to integrate the health crisis into the well-being of ASEAN. And we have a deeper integration from digitalization, and that give acceleration before COVID. We need to also think about a global issue of environment, SDG, and WTO. We're talking about the SDG and COP26, all that. This is something new that ASEAN not been able to do much, and as well about the, last but not least, about geopolitics of the region. that involve, of course, superpower rivalry, US-China, that we've been talking a lot. Last and not least, of course, about the BIMSTEC cooperation and ASEAN, that's all been addressed. I will only add just 2 more minutes, please, I will share. I think is very important, as I mentioned, is if you look at the ASEAN story, it very much the story of I try to building trust, that and we try to, as we said, we try to look at, accommodate everyone, and let's go to the originates ASEAN, try to deciding in a consensual way, non-interference into neighbor affairs. Some might say that it might not work quite if you're taking the Myanmar crisis and later case and ASEAN try to deal with. We could come back into the discussion, but overall, it's still there, and ASEAN try to moving ahead. And this is something I would say is important for BIMSTEC as well. Although the story of BIMSTEC, we have Ambassador Sumit, we discussed when they be at the 10 and 20 anniversary of BIMSTEC. ASEAN story is older, but we think it is important concept that we try to move it together. And of course, Myanmar for the moment in big trouble. I think is whatever will not going to be the strategic or political intervention, but I think this is important if we look at it, because everyone is neighbor from everyone, and we should try to provide humanitarian corridors and provide other assistance that is necessary to help Myanmar, of course. But how to, of course, and I will not have time to talk about the kind of contentious issue that ASEAN still have about the 5 points that we've been able to, we try to agree since last April, still not respected, and that's perhaps Myanmar not invited to the summit this month. And the few points about I would say, for trade agreement and that cooperation, if ASEAN could provide for, the kind of trade agreement that we have, I would say BIMSTEC should try to even moving for shallow FTA. I'm not quite agree with the other two, but they're still in connection to connectivity that we need to move ahead. Of course, trade and connectivity integration have to move hand in hand. So we cannot do one and another. And in due time, if you not do now, we will come back later. And that will be perhaps some more credibility to BIMSTEC in looking from outside as already so many FTA all around. So why not try to moving and accommodate who not able, and ASEAN do it in a asymmetrical way, we not force anyone. And of course, about the value chain, I think this is something very good time, and for that at this critical juncture, we should try to moving in BIMSTEC as a whole. And because this is another opportunity that I see that BIMSTEC could coming in. Of course, we should not think about the land. Of course, I agree. Maritime BIMSTEC is important, and there's a lot of issue that the region have been able to sustain very well. I would say BIMSTEC model already, we should not forget, is already sustainable in a way, maybe looking about the electricity that we use related to things. People are quite resilient, whatever the crisis, natural disaster we have. And we should keep that in mind. A lot of things that will be done already on the ground, or even in Bangladesh could be the kind of the credit, that you have So a lot of pieces and things that we have to build up. I would say you don't have to jump ahead, but adding on what we already been doing well, and that should be very much the kind of principle that ASEAN and BIMSTEC is. We have to offer the kind of cooperation in moving forward. Thank you. And sorry for pushing so much
Thank
time.
you, Professor Sudipant. Actually, is definitely, we'll come back to you during the open discussion session. And we have around 40 to 45 minutes for the open discussion session. And I can see already in the chat box some very interesting questions or comments. I can read these out for the panelists. And there are some questions for, it's for all the panelists, and there are some specific questions too. And I may also request some of the commenters if he or she can also speak up if he wants to. But let me first, Rabiul Islam, he has a question for Dr. Sanjay Kataria. What are the implications of formation of Quad for the BIMSTEC countries, given that India belongs to both? Then there is a question from Ishrat Sharmin. She was asking about, while we discuss connectivity and trade facility issues of the Bay of Bengal region, the ongoing pandemic, which technically will not be over, have created the space of regional collaboration in pharmaceuticals and vaccination process, which may move forward other kind of issues as well. How do you see actually this is an open question for all of us, see the regional pandemic response so far, and how should the region move forward? I think that's a very important question, especially given the fact that how these countries actually make the recoveries, and the pandemic management is extremely important. There's another question from Safa Tasnim. She asked about the actions in terms of regional connectivity, help in controlling increasing the inflation and stopping the stagflation. I think that's a question actually after hearing from Dr. Indrajit Kumarasamy. Probably he can respond to that question. One question by Zarin Tasnim, she asked about what would be the greater impact of Kaladan multimodal transit transport project on the Bay of Bengal? So anyone can respond to that. Then another question by Sithi Ahmed from Bangladesh University of Professionals, and she asked about that, what are the possible institutional challenges in the context of Bangladesh for developing strong regional connectivity? I think Professor Mustafizur Rahman can pick up this question. Another question from Afifa, she asked about the possible challenges for LDCs, LDC graduation, and how can regional connectivity help? Probably Professor Mustafizur Rahman can respond to that too. And another question for Professor Rahman from Ishrat Shamin about, I think, the skills in various sectors and the Bay of Bengal, how to mitigate the skill gaps to diversify the export basket, and improve our share in regional global value chain. I think this is something common for all the countries in this region. I just want to read out the first set of questions so that we can have one round of response, then I'll get to the next round. But let me stop here. So let me stop here and get the first response, set of response from the panelists. So who wants to start with Sanjay, and then I think we can. Sure. So if you spend around 2 minutes, so that we can have another round.
Sure. No, thank you very much, and thank you to all my distinguished panelists for their very erudite comments. So I'll take up a couple of the questions. So one was the implications of Quad for BIMSTEC, where India is a common factor in both. And I think obviously Quad is a very, in its new avatar, it's a very new, it started many years ago in 2007 after the tsunami, but right now it has a new avatar. So if the Quad moves ahead, right, if it, according to its intent, then India will, for example, become even more important in the pharmaceutical space, right? It is meant to become a kind of hub for, it is already the vaccine supplier to the world, so-called, but, the Quad countries want to put a lot of energy in making India a pharma hub. So I think if that happens, and of course, and apart from pharma, there is partnership in many strategic sectors, which, especially in new technologies, in 5G, in, electronics, chips, and so on. So India will have, as the sort of as the lowest, potentially the lowest cost producer amongst these countries, the developing country amongst this, will have a very important role to play in the manufacturing sector more broadly. And BIMSTEC can benefit from this process if the regional value chains are created, as Mustafa has also outlined. So, and in a more broadly, the Quad, again, if it succeeds in its mission or in its intent, then it can help the BIMSTEC countries, especially, broadly BIMSTEC, but, ASEAN even more broadly, that it can help reduce for what for many countries has become a goal, which is to reduce dependence on China from an economic point of view, right? So, and that's a goal of diversification is something which all countries strive for. So that's my answer on one of them. The other question, Salim, you had asked after my talk, you had said about what is the change in particular after COVID. So I just want to address that too. So to reiterate some of the points that I had made in case it was not too apparent. So I think what has happened after COVID is basically accelerated, right? A lot of the pre-COVID trends. So, but in particular, things that have come forward is the desire to have supply chain redundancy. I mean, you build in extra slack into the value chain, into the supply, so that you don't have you're not held hostage by shortages which come up because of things like the pandemic. There is the pressure as a result for nearshoring, which means, as Mustafiz also said, so there is a greater impetus possibly for regional value chains. The diversification out of China has gained again more impetus. And as trade costs have gone up, right? Again, Mustafiz also said this. As trade costs have gone up, air costs, shipping costs, we know there's complete chaos in containers, for example, globally, right? The costs have gone up 5 to 6 times on some routes. This again gives a compelling logic for regionalization, right? You want to be located at home or as close to home as possible. So I think these, for me, provide important reasons for COVID. So I'll stop here, Salim. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. May I invite Professor Rahman? And then I'll take up some other questions and I'll get back to the other panelists.
Thank you, Salim.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Salim. I think the questions from the floor were really great and are very important in terms of taking our discourse forward. Now, Salim, you asked about the linkage between RVC and the GVCs. And I would like to mention that it's very important that we take advantage of the RVCs, not only to widen and deepen our regional integration and export diversification, market diversification, but also in order to have strengthened global integration. So I think that, for example, I was giving the example of Vietnam. Now, when Vietnam will be exporting to the European Union at zero tariff, and we will be paying, in a reverse position, we will be paying 10% tariff for our apparels. I think that the cooperation in the spinning, weaving, ready-made garmenting, sectors in the value chain in ready-made garments will be very important to take advantage of our comparative advantages and then get into the global value chain in European and US and North American market. So I think this is very much connected. With regard to the institutional challenges, LDC graduation and skills gap, I think that that is obviously there has to be institutional collaboration. For example, I think Sanjay mentioned about the mutual recognition agreement. I think that these are very important. As of now, only 25 items, as Sanjay mentioned, but we do export hundreds of items. So we need our strengthened institutions with mutual accreditation, mutual recognition of certification, lab testing, so that our borders don't become control points, they become crossing points. So I think that institutional collaboration is very important. It's just not investment and just not transport, but institutions of trade. And of course, LDC graduation, as I was mentioning, that the whole scenario will be changing for our 3 graduating LDC members of BIMSTEC. And the BIMSTEC wide collaboration could be important, strategic option for them to make the transition, as I was mentioning, from the preferential market access driven competitiveness to productivity and skills driven competitiveness. So this is a great opportunity. Yes, a skills gap, yes, but I would like to once again, recall what Professor Panagaria said. And he said that 4th industrial revolution, yes, it will be there, and it is inevitable, but it will come in a phased way. And that's what we have seen in the past industrial revolution stages as well. So BIMSTEC wide collaboration could be a stepping stone in order to get into the 4th industrial revolution. So there will be labor displacing technologies, yes, but it is not going to come suddenly. So the regional cooperation gives us a sort of a stepping stone opportunity to prepare ourselves for the inevitable 4th industrial revolution. So this is very important. And the last point that I would like to make is that, and that covers all the 4 questions, is that you see, in an open market regime, there will be closer cooperation, transport cooperation, trade cooperation, investment cooperation, but we should make a distinction between regionalization and regionalism. Regionalization takes place in an open market economy. There will be more, as you open up, you will trade more with your neighbors. But what is the pacing, sequencing, phasing of that integration? With regionalism, a conscious policy choice through your trade, through your logistics policies, through your investment policies, you can stimulate that process. So I think that we should not be hostage to regionalization just, we should be active participant of regionalism, which is a conscious policy choice. And BIMSTEC offers us that conscious policy choice. And that's why it is very important that we take the framework of a BIMSTEC as an opportunity also to go forward and just not leave everything to market mechanism. It will happen, but at a very slow pace. So I would like to end by that. Thank you, Salim.
Thank you, Professor Rahman. I will read out some questions from the chat box, then I'll get back to the other panelists, because I think the questions are kind of some follow-up question and also very related one. For example, one question from Ugyen Pemap, he's from Bhutan, I suppose. He's asking, all the experts talk with passion on the deepening the regional integration in our region, unexploited big pie. This has been the feeling of all the countries for some time now, but there is still not much headway. All of us in this region seem to be focused on bilateral agreements only. So in your opinion, any panelist, which or what is the biggest stumbling block to the effective regional integration that we'll dream of, and what would be the best next step to resolve this economic gains from we are all convinced of? So that is, I think, one important question. Then Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja, he raised 2 questions, and he actually praised the panelists for the excellent presentation. First one is, how can we avoid regional cooperation through BIMSTEC falling into the same inactive state that has befallen SAARC? So I think we don't really want to repeat the experience what we had in SAARC. That is the first question. And second, does ASEAN's regional cooperation experience offer lessons for BIMSTEC on how to deal with the elephant in the room, China? So anyone can answer. Probably we'll definitely go to Professor Sutipant and then come to other panelists. And he's also asking another key issue for any of the panel. it realistic to expect? Is realistic to expect? And what are the tentative steps, particularly for modern service development? I think another question was by Pushpa Sharma. Actually, he was adding to Dr. Ganeshan's question. It is not just China, except all countries have signed to the BRI, but also the US factor. He thought the Indo-Pacific issue is contentious, at least in the case of Nepal. If BIMSTEC have political ramifications. We have seen this in the case of the MCC grant in Nepal. Also, Nepal did not participate in the BIMSTEC security drill perhaps last year or a year back. So BIMSTEC certainly is not only about economics, but importantly politics. What could be the way forward? I think I'll just stop by just adding one question from Achit Bhandari. So he asked about, he's from Bhutan, he asked the question about, while the logic of BIMSTEC might be economic and not strategic, as mentioned by Dr. Khaturiya, there is no room to celebrate its achievements after 25 years. The increase in interregional trade, actually, he talked about that it's not that very big, and it's outside of its FTA framework. So despite initial enthusiasm, political differences has hampered BIMSTEC progress. What are the underlying reasons for optimism now? So I'll stop here and I'll start with Professor Suthipanand, and then I'll move to other panelists. So Professor Suthipanand, over to you in 2 to 3 minutes, please. You have to unmute.
Thank you, Chair. In fact, there are so many interesting questions. Let me go back to the last question a bit. That's maybe talking about how to going forward about the global or regional or sub-regional value chain. I think I have to remind you that this is something not happened overnight, and the experience of ASEAN was quite telling. When we moved to export-oriented industrialization, mostly in the 80s, except the Singapore. Before we have the Vietnam or Cambodia or Laos, Myanmar joining in. But of course, Vietnam is a good runner in the 90s when it comes to ASEAN, and that still still take many years. And I would say very important when you're talking about the who will drive this kind of at the top of GVC. That's something that of course, apart from global multinational, we have very much East Asia multinational. Early on would be Japan, Korea, Taiwan, then all this, and even Singapore among ASEAN, because they have more knowledge and know-how to do it. So I would say that's why the ASEAN regionalism is very much connected, and perhaps you can say biased toward East Asia in that kind of regional kind of value chain and global value chain. So we work very closely in that. That this is something I wish to see, how the ASEAN, of course, extending to BIMSTEC, and we've been talking among a researcher, Professor Pabiade is one of them, and many authors in South Asia, we be looking at it. So I think is looking forward, I think is connectivity is very important in 3 areas as ASEAN mentioned. Soft connectivity we mentioned today as about the efficiency of border management, particularly post-COVID. People-to-people connectivity, for example, would be the business sector. Ease of doing business in the region, very important. And hard connectivity, let me think, of course, about the infrastructure and all that, that's we're talking about. And of course, we cannot forget about the digital connectivity. So all these have to look into it, and work closely with those countries. If we look talking about Act East or like India doing, so we have to connect from ASEAN to East Asia. That's something I think very important. About China, very shortly, because they said, well, it's not that easy because nowadays among the intra-ASEAN trade, which is almost 30% of the total trade of ASEAN is intra-trade. But with external partner, China moved very fast from only 1 or 2% when China moved into WTO and signed FTA with ASEAN around 2001, 2002. And then today, if you think about it, China become #1 trading partner of ASEAN, you know, from only 1 or 2% to something like 12, 13, 14, 15%, you know, of total trade of ASEAN. It depends on if you pick up the Vietnam. Vietnam is very much connected to China, despite strategic differences. And as well, you go to Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand. The same, we are heavily dependent and in a kind of value chain connected to China, in addition to what we have in Japan and Korea, you know, and regional partners. So that this is something maybe talking about a few years back before the COVID and the trade war. This is something, the exercise that ASEAN tried to work on about the future of things to come, you know, the kind of rivalry of superpower, US on one side with alliance, Australia already choosing clearly to be with the US, and the other side, of course, China try to moving in. I will not have time because I done also the book on the ASEAN, you know, the BI in ASEAN countries, and review coming out. But this is also part of the picture that China using both, of course, trade, investment, and connectivity to moving ASEAN, which make ASEAN difficult if you're walking through. Some already mentioned about the high-speed train to Vientiane and pushing to Bangkok soon. You know, that's something to happen, and through Myanmar to the side. I would say very important to look also on the BIMSTEC side would be the Myanmar question, not only gas pipeline, not only the train project and the port and all that. So I think this is upcoming China is still there, despite weakened by the COVID with the domestic problem. But China continue to be present, and that BI project would be in complement with the trade and investment integration. So perhaps I could come back. I used already too much time at this round.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Sothipan. I will come to, of course, to Dr. Indrajit Kumarasamy. So, Sumit, if you can unmute, please, in 2 to 3 minutes. And the hand raised by Saifur Rahman, I'll definitely come back to you after we have this round of discussion.
Thank you, Salim. I think there were different types of questions about the future of BIMSTEC, and then whether we can be proud of BIMSTEC achievements after 25 years. That's next year. I think I would like to make few submissions there, which I could not. In fact, Professor Mustafizur made a very important distinction between regionalization and regionalism. So that's the. I think I just wanted to add one thing there. Regionalism is the policy integration and policy coordination part, not the regionalization. Now, if you take all the member states of BIMSTEC, and not only for that, but also the several countries in the region, Asia and the Pacific, you can identify one of the very important foreign policy initiative. The foreign policy initiative is that their commitment for regional cooperation. Now, That is why in my presentation, I wanted to go back to 1947. Even at the time, the India and Sri Lanka both were not independent, but the importance of regional cooperation had been identified as part of their foreign policy agenda when they become sovereign and independent countries. So you become part of a regional organization by your choice, which is we infer that by doing so, that you have a commitment to foster regional cooperation as part of one of the pillars of your foreign policy. But now, having said that, right, you are a member, but you can be a muted member, you can be an active member. So that is why I mentioned about the future of any regional organization will depend on the leadership. I mean, this is not just a hearsay, because we have seen that in the case of ASEAN, Professor Suchpan also can elaborate further if necessary. But in rest of the world, European Union, and then some of the flourishing regional organizations in Africa and South America and Latin America. So there is an important to implement that commitment. Now, for example, SAARC was initially initiated by President Ziaur Rahman, of late President of Bangladesh. Now, I have seen whoever who comes to the power in Bangladesh, there is a continued commitment to regional cooperation. Now, that's a political commitment. Whether it was an idea of X, Y, or Z, that thread is there without any change. So that is one of the important things. Now, that is where we need to do. We need to achieve that. That is why I raised that question. What is the cost of non-cooperation? Somebody will have to ask that. I mean, naturally, this question should be asked from an outsider. Then only we can realize that. Otherwise, we will not be able to do that. I don't think that. I'm not quite sure about whether the BIMSTEC will have the same fate of SAARC, because Sanjay's initial submission, it was very clear that India, as the largest country in the grouping, has no political problems with any of the member states. But even if you see that within ASEAN, now there are problems. There are subtle political, economic, and strategic competition, and other things are there. But the commitment to regional cooperation as part of the foreign policy posture and initiative is the most important thing. Now, how do you foster that? I suppose there are two elements to that. Now, being in the foreign policy establishment for 34 years, I think it is for the political authority as well as the foreign policy practitioners to say that this has to be done. This is the way forward. Now, if the foreign policy practitioners are inactive, then I don't think I have not seen that activation of the political authority in any of the member states. So this is the problem now. That problem is there. Now, that is apart from the economic compulsion and policy integration and conscious, as Professor Mustafa said, conscious attempt for deep regional integration. That is my submission. Then there was a question again about the services, trading services. Now, I would like to bring an example from Sri Lanka. I'm not aware about the other. Any liberalization any liberalization in services trade in services in Sri Lanka will be a problem. It has been a problem. And Dr. Kumaraswamy knows that it has been a problem because it is not a problem from the purely economic point of view, but it's a purely political problem. That is why we had the problems with the conclusion of SEPA and ECTA with India and several other agreements. So services, yes, there will be a problem, and in order to address that, I think one needs a political acumenship and statesmanship in every individual member states. Now, on top of that, although we talk about economic cooperation, integration, maybe practical or theoretical manner, but if you have at the grassroots level in any given country flourishing economic nationalism, you can't do that. That's the problem. That is where we stuck. If you see the ups and downs of any regional organization, this problem has been there. So this is, I really do not know, Salim, whether I have answered to all questions, but then since the questions are in different layers, I thought that I will give a fairly general response so that I can come back to the questions again if there is time. Thank you, Salim.
Thank you, Sweet. May I now move to Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, please?
Thank you, Salim.
You can respond to any of these questions, please.
Yes. Before I do that, do you want me to address the question you posed to me at the beginning, at the end of my remarks?
Sure.
Okay, fine. So I think the question was that fiscal policy has not been very successful in addressing the problems of MSMEs. I think that was the question, I think. And that's, fiscal policy is, I would argue, not the appropriate instrument really to achieve that objective. I think one would be better off doing it through the central bank and the financial institutions, because you can have interest subsidies, you can have guarantee programs, etc., which are targeted specifically at the MSMEs. Clearly, I mean, this is only the financing part of the challenge in terms of supporting MSMEs. And I think there is now an emerging consensus that you need a whole package of support to get at the MSME sector kind of become more dynamic. But I think from a financing point of view, I don't think fiscal policy is not really flexible enough to do that. And as I said, interest rate subsidies and guarantees are probably the two best instruments, and the central bank is best placed to administer those. On regional integration and why it has not really gathered momentum in our region, and our region, I think, still is by some way the least integrated region in the world. I think one factor is the whole kind of historical legacy, which has made nation building in our region complex and difficult, and the tensions coming out of that has created mistrust, which has persisted for 73 years. And here I think we need to learn from our neighbors to the east. I mean, there's a difficult historical legacy between Japan and Korea, South Korea, Japan and China, etc. But they're able to overcome those trust deficit factors based on the historical legacy by being very pragmatic when it comes to doing business. In South Asia, we have too much emotion and not enough pragmatism. And I think this is something we need to transcend if we are going to really get over this problem that has held us back for so long. That is one. Emotion can be there, that's fine. But don't let it get in the way of, taking advantage of good economic opportunities. The second point I'd like to make is that I think probably the enabling conditions now are significantly better than they've ever been. And a lot of that has to do with India and the Indian economy. The Indian economy is on a much higher trajectory of growth now. And this ABC mindset, anything but China mindset that one is seeing from some quarters, is a strong tailwind for India as well. And so it's possible, maybe the conditions are being created for India to play the kind of role that first Japan and then China played in dragging East and Southeast Asia upwards. And what are the conditions that have been created? One, I think, as I said, is a higher growth rate in India. The second is the Make in India strategy. If that really gains traction, there could be new supply chain opportunities that are created within the region. And we've heard all the arguments about building resilience into supply chains. And clearly proximity is one, the point that has been made more than once as being an important factor in that respect. And supporting that, in the past, we have had proximity, but terrible infrastructure. So the transaction costs of having any kind of cross-border production networks were extremely high. Sri Lanka is 20 miles from India, but the roads, the ports, and the airports were so bad that the transaction costs were too high to do business across the border. But now we're seeing, infrastructure improving. Particularly in the northeast of the subcontinent, we are seeing significant improvements that are taking place in terms of connectivity. And I think that's now creating a whole new paradigm, which I think, would provide far better enabling conditions for us to push regional cooperation in a way that it hasn't been possible in the past. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Indrajit Kumarasamy. I think it was an excellent comments from your side and very, very useful. So we have a few minutes left. I just want, let me share with you my plan of utilizing that, few minutes. So I will give the floor to Professor Rahman. There is a question also on the Bangladesh economy, whether Bangladesh can take the lead to promote blue carbon economy in the Bay of Bengal through national policy strategies. So after Professor Rahman speaks, then I'll give the floor to Sanjay, and then Nihal for some closing remarks. So because we have around 7 minutes left. So if any other panelist wants to have any kind of pressing points, please tell me. I will definitely come back to you. So Professor Rahman, over to you in 2 minutes, please. You have to unmute.
Yes, Salim, I am not an expert on blue carbon, opportunities in our region. But just to say that, as I was mentioning, that the Bay of Bengal do really provide us with an opportunity to collaborate in terms of taking the advantage of the blue economy, and blue carbon economy is a part of that. So I think that there are opportunities, but I cannot go deeper into those issues. Perhaps there are other experts. I would like to, however, look at the very important question that was put by Dr. Ganeshan, and he has written about it, and we have learned from his writings. And Indrajit has also answered that. But I would like to say that yes, SAARC was not very effective. Also, we know that the Pakistan-India bilateral relationship, and we thought that BIMSTEC would be an opportunity because Pakistan is not there, and also BIMSTEC gives us an opportunity to have our footprint in the ASEAN market through two of the members, Thailand and Myanmar. And now we also see the Rohingya issue coming up, and there are this is a stumbling block as well. But within the BIMSTEC framework, I think that we should not think about in a mutually exclusive way the sub-regional cooperation that are emerging and are possible. In WTO, we say that coalitions of variable geometry. So I think that the coalitions of variable geometry are possible, sector specific, economic opportunity specific within the BIMSTEC. And we are seeing these sub-regional opportunities coming up. So I think that the better should not be the enemy of the best. And it's always a gradual process. Look at European Union. It started with 6 countries and in one sector, coal. And then from preferential trading arrangement, free trade area, customs union, common market, economic union. Over the time, they have gradually, incrementally, they have added to that. So I think that I look at it from a longer term perspective as building blocks. So that it will be my position on that. And there was also the issue that Pushpa, I think, very important point, the geostrategic interest versus the geo-economic interest are very important. But I think that there will be a departure of interest between, for example, India, which is a major global player, then compared to countries like Nepal, Bhutan, or Bangladesh. So I think that our geo-economic interests can override the geostrategic, the tensions which are there, and then that may be also one of the advantages. With regard to the first question of blue carbon economy, I would like to just mention also that if you look at, for example, Salim, you mentioned about regional value chain and global value chain, and if you look at the EU new GSP proposal, you will see that they have added green growth as an essential element of exporting to the European Union with some preferences, be it everything but arms for the LDCs, or EU GSP plus, or the general GSP scheme. So they have added that you will have to ratify the Paris Accord. You will have to produce in a green friendly manner in order to enter into the European market. So I think that taking advantage of clean energy, which Swanee mentioned very strongly, and taking advantage of green growth in our region in a collaborative manner can be an opportunity for translating the regional value chain advantages into global strength and integration advantages. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rahman. Sanjay, now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Salim.
2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes.
Sure. I will take up 3 questions very quickly. One, just to add to what Indrajit said on reasons, the question was on reasons for optimism now on BIMSTEC. I mean, we'll all have our favorite reasons, but I think Indrajit's were compelling. I would say that I would add the something that Mustafi said, the push for LDCs graduating sort of adds to that pressure. So there's going to be some, if they have a vision, if the countries that are graduating, the 3 countries, there is self-interest now in seeking a market. And I would also add one more point is that, the world is moving ahead. There are mega regionals happening. RCEP is happening now. It is therefore up to the, Myanmar and Thailand are part of RCEP. But if the South Asia doesn't want to be left out, then they have to do something in this part of the world, right? So, otherwise there's going to be very significant preference erosion, not just for the LDCs, but for everybody, right? So I think there is a real push there coming from that side. So it's part of a pull, partly a pull, partly a push. So I hope BIMSTEC or the Bay of Bengal region can move with those forces. The second question was on the stumbling blocks, any practical opportunities. Again, Indrajit also mentioned that. I would want to just supplement that. So I think the protectionism, I talked about it, the protectionism of all the South Asian countries, right? Including now recently India, last 4 or 5 years, increasing. That's not good news for any kind of, trade connectivity, regional value chain effort. Every country is going the wrong way. And mind you, as we know, South Asia started from a very high base to begin with. It was already the most protected region in the world. And now it is becoming even more so. It is becoming a complete outlier. Now, that doesn't apply to Myanmar and Thailand, but at least these 5 countries of South Asia certainly applies to them. So then there is, of course, the connectivity issues, which we've all talked about. Now, what could be some practical ways to achieve some kind of momentum, right? The incremental and gain some momentum. I think I would say 2 things. One would be to seek connectivity along something very specific, along, not grand Kaladan, trilateral corridor type of thing, but seek something very specific. Connect 2 points, which are big, major hubs, and say, okay, can we connect them? Will this galvanize some kind of trade? And in a similar vein, can we sort of push some kind of FDI in a particular sector that is very promising, right? FDI is obviously private sector. So, you can only take the horse to water, you can't make him drink. But, you bring, how far can you push the FDI, say, in the pharma value chain, where India is perhaps going to become even more prominent, as I mentioned. So these are, I think, some of the practical points on how can you move this region forward. And the final one, I think, with Ganesh, I want to supplement what Mustafi said. Ask, what can we learn? For me, ASEAN and the broader East Asian experience, I think one is what we had is people to people and travel, right? The air connectivity in ASEAN is phenomenal, right? So we are very proud, and we put it in our report, glass half full, right? But India, Sri Lanka air connectivity, right? But that's like pales into insignificance. When you look at Singapore, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, right? It's like 6 or 7 times, even though the economies are so much smaller, right? So people to people and travel engenders, obviously it's very important for foreign investment and all of that, so, right? So I think that's very, so that would be one area that I think we can learn from East Asia. Second is low tariffs, unilateral liberalization. They didn't wait, didn't have to wait for the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. There was a lot of unilateral liberalization after they got the initial, industrial policy and all done. And then the third thing is having a kind of big regional investor, an anchor investor, right? So Japan played that role in the beginning, and Singapore plays that role now. Now, India should play that role. It doesn't play that role because India has its own issues of, its policies, which are not conducive to playing that role of so India being a base for, foreign investors coming and then diversifying and fanning out to the region. So a kind of hub and spoke in FDI, right? And we will, next month, we will have an FDI report coming out, of which I'm one of the authors in the World Bank. And, we can talk more about FDI, but I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Sanjay. Excellent. Over to Nihal. I think you can actually share your thoughts, and also you have to unmute. And you heard 6 panelists. Difficult to summarize, but yes, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I think that, thank you very much for the panelists. This has been excellent. And knowing that this is a familiar territory for a lot of our colleagues, that I'm sure given time that we can go on for a few more hours with a glass of water. And I think that maybe, one thing we could do is, looking forward, that we will try to address some of the questions, and those who haven't been addressed comprehensively or adequately, maybe, Salim, we need to think of creating a forum to continue these discussions and, open them to participants. Let's explore it. Just a parting thought from my end, it's a 30-year memory doing a thesis on GVS, is that since we have spoken a lot about the regional value chain, there's some fundamental characteristics that from the advent of the global value chains that one need to sort of think about. Sit and think. First is the market dynamics. US was a principal pulling force, along with the EU, with a very low or zero tariff regime. This coupled with the decline of the transport and communication costs in terms of the relative value of merchandise that has given rise to their trend. So in this context, I will caution everybody when you think of an FTA is not important. The empirism basically suggests that incentive structure is absolutely important for agents to react and respond. In this context, I think Professor Rahman has mentioned, I think we should think of maybe the region plus framework. Okay, that's it, maybe to be discussed, to be continued. But in the conclusion, I think there's a need to reflect some of these themes in the panelists presented in our training approach as well. So we'll certainly reach out to the panelists for the guidance. We'll keep you informed. In conclusion, we'll keep you informed of the schedules for the training program and get your thoughts as well. Since the programs are still tentative. Over to you, Salim. That's it from me.
Thank you very much, Nihal. And I must thank all the panelists. It was an excellent session, I think more than 2.5 hours. And I also thank all the participants that listened to it very, with much interest, and also they participated by raising questions, also sharing their comments and views. Thank you so much, and I look forward to interacting with you even during the training sessions as pointed out by Nihal, and we also need your guidance, and we'll come back to you, for your guidance and your, kind of ideas sharing. And some of the ideas, what Nihal said, that we could not actually discuss much here, and we'll be trying to actually create a platform for a kind of live discussion so that this discussion can continue. So with this, we can actually conclude the session, and thanks. I know some parts of the world is already very late, and here as well, it's Friday here in Bangladesh. So thank you so much, and see you soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Friends, see you. We'll be in touch.
Yes, of course.
Okay, Salim. Okay, Nihal.
Then there are some really interesting points.